Welcome to Emergent Behavior, where we explore this moment in time just before artificial intelligence changes the world as we know it, where we talk to the builders and creators, entrepreneurs and engineers, where we ask questions to which we don't actually know the answers to. I'm your host, Prakash Narayanan, known on Twitter as AdaPi. Hello and welcome to Emergent Behavior. I'm thrilled to have Cecilia Ziniti with me today, founder and CEO of GCAI. Cecilia is an absolute force in the legal tech world, having honed her skills at renowned firms like Morrison & Foster and in-house at companies like Amazon and Replit. She's also a passionate investor in and advisor to a range of innovative companies in AI, compliance, and software. It's a testament to Cecilia's vision and expertise that she saw the need for a powerful AI tool for in-house counsel and built GCAI to address that need. Today, we'll be diving into what GCAI is and how it's revolutionizing how in-house legal teams operate. Cecilia's take on the future of the legal profession, exploring which roles will be most impacted by AI and what skills will be most valuable. How AI is affecting the role of lawyers in regulated industries like finance and healthcare. The challenges of building and deploying legal AI systems, from liability and regulation to training data and bias. The ethical implications of AI, exploring how companies are grappling with the responsibility of developing and deploying AI tools. Cecilia has a unique blend of experience as a lawyer, investor, and founder, making her insights into the intersection of AI and law particularly valuable. This episode will be of interest to anyone working in the legal profession, as well as technology enthusiasts curious about the future of the law and artificial intelligence. As always, if you enjoy the show, the number one thing you can do to support us is to follow Emergent Behavior on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every follow massively boosts our reach. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at emergentbehavior.co to stay up to date on all our latest episodes, including my research and preparation notes for each podcast. And you can find me on Twitter at numeric8TEAPI. Without further ado, please enjoy this insightful conversation with Cecilia Ziniti, founder of GCAI. So, Cecilia, what is GCAI?
Yeah, so GCAI is AI for in-house counsel. So I was a lawyer for a long time, general counsel for 10 years, and never before had tech that I got really excited about until AI. So I had the aha moment. We can talk about that, but essentially it's chat-based modality, ask questions. We've done a bunch of fine tuning. We built our own web browser, built our own PDF parser, that kind of thing, and taken the accuracy and other basically AI metrics way up to where in-house lawyers really like it.
So, and because a lot of people are maybe a little bit less aware of what lawyers do, so you have, the general counsel who is hired by the company, and the general counsel's role is, what would you say the role is?
Yeah, so in the last 20 odd years, there's been this explosion in in-house lawyers. And so in-house lawyers are not like you see on, LA Law or the firm or even Suits, but they are lawyers employed at the company. So working alongside with people there. So for example, at Google, they employ a lot of folks in the in-house legal team in the thousands, and they're really sort of part of product development. So that's where I came from. And in terms of what a general counsel does, they are considered to be really the strategic advisor to the CEO, right? So anything to do with risk, anything to do with law, public policy, they get into a lot of PR considerations. But essentially, it's a, what is the metaphor? Soup to nuts, end to end, full stack, all these things you would say. But essentially, the company's lawyer. But really, a person that just helps the company achieve its goals, particularly in regulated areas and or where there's IP or other transactions that are super important, where that legal skill set, being a business person and having a legal skill set makes a difference.
Yeah, and when I was looking at the GCAI material, I think one of the examples given was someone asking the question, can we ask our users when they're unsubscribing from an email list, can we ask our users to re-enter their email rather than it just being automatic unsubscribe? And then there was like a kind of consideration of like what the actual rules were, whether it was allowed or whether it had to be a one-click unsubscribe, for example, right?
Yeah, so that's a great example of a question that an in-house lawyer answer. So there's the law, right? So can spam was an act of Congress, and it does what it said it did. It sets regulations around how you can do email. But the actual, like, okay, you're an engineer or you're a marketer and you're doing something and you're like, hey, I think it would increase growth or it would reduce the amount of unsubscribe if we added just a little bit more friction to the process of unsubscribing.
Yeah.
Now, in this particular case, the law doesn't actually state the mechanic. It doesn't say it has to be one click. So, two clicks, or in this case, having to enter the email address is okay. But that's something that's kind of a judgment call, right? So, in this scenario, the in house lawyer would look at the law or know the law and make the call. Now, if your company was under particular scrutiny with the FTC over your email practices, if I was your company's lawyer, I'd say, hey, look, you can require users to re-put their email, but I'd actually advise going ahead and making it one click. So full interesting body of law on this one around subscriptions, for example. So you might have heard of like Fabletics. They were literally a yoga pants subscription company.
Mhm.
You could sign up for this yoga pants subscription online, $40 a month or whatever, and you get yoga pants ad nauseum every month. But the flip side, if you wanted to cancel, you had to call on the phone and it was a 2 hour wait. So that was
Wow.
actually held to be illegal, as it should be, right? And they got investigated and I think they settled it. But in that scenario, that kind of business and market knowledge, you're a good in-house counsel would bring those factors to bear versus just applying the law or versus just telling you, okay, go look up can spam yourself. That being said, can spam is another great example. There's a whole like infrastructure around email compliance, right? So I use HubSpot now and they have a whole UI around it, and that's part of what they sell. So in these areas that are a little bit more settled, like email, counsel's job is a little bit less. In areas that are more cutting edge, like AI, I literally we can talk about this, but the head of litigation at Latham and Watkins, which is a huge firm, said in public, I love AI because it makes great work for litigators. And so, kind of a different approach.
So let's get into that. Why did he say that? He or she say that? Like what was the context behind that?
Yeah, so I can actually pull it up. I think I put it in my newsletter, but essentially, the reason that they said that was that very similar to GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation out of Europe in 2017, 2018. Essentially, whenever there's this new tech, it's always a question of how is the law going to apply to that tech? And
Right.
AI is that, right? Like, what is the metaphor which we should use? Is it Napster? Is it atomic bomb, as some people have said? And so, in that scenario, whenever there's like these big movements of money and changes of technology, you need lawyers. And so I think that's the
Right.
opportunity that this person saw. And let me pull up the exact quote. We can drop it in the show notes, the article that she gave. But it's a very serious interview. She says artificial intelligence is great for litigators as a source of cases. And then she continued, she doesn't think the technology has reached a level where she could rely on it. So, I mean, that's probably a pretty consensus view among big law now, is that the tech's not there yet. But I think the smart lawyers, at least among our users, and then just probably your listeners too, the smart lawyers are embracing it.
So what about this idea that it's really the bottom 50 to 70% that's going to be wiped out, right? Like it's not your Latham Watkins, it's not your litigation practice, it's like the form filling lawyers who do kind of like, in corporations and
Yeah.
your bread and butter every day, $100, $200 an hour lawyers who are, just basically just, form
Yeah.
filling. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I definitely think there will be this elite class of super lawyers.
Mm,
My personal, my thesis is that a big part of that will be in-house counsel because
mhm,
closer to the business, the companies are going to want to keep the data within their four walls, and because in-house lawyers are already trained to be generalists and have that market knowledge that I mentioned. That
mhm,
being said, will the bottom fall out? Like, yeah, I mean, when you saw the rise of Excel, the profession of bookkeeper, like bookkeeper as a title, went away. Like, and you can look at this. There was, I think, I don't even remember if it was your tweet, but there was a tweet essentially showing, the rise of Excel in sales and the decline of the title bookkeeper. And they were like effectively one to one. And so, like, are there the equivalent bookkeepers, the form fillers of law? Yes. And that being said, when I had my own law firm for a while, Ziniti Law PC, which I still maintain, I used LegalZoom for my incorporation because I'm like, look, I
mm,
don't need to make a huge innovation here. I could do it myself. But why? It's very simple. It's a one person professional corporation. It's fine. And I do it. And that convenience was something that software could offer very easily. I read the documents, of course, but I didn't have anything unusual. That being said, for GCAI, we're venture backed and we have, I hired an attorney and she's very good. We had some unusual, things related to my co-founder Bardia is in Canada, and some various different things where when you want things to be 100% right, which is
mhm,
pretty often with law,
mhm,
that's where you're going to want that. The other scenario that I see lawyers are going to be maintained, your Lathams of the world, people with unique experience, right? So, good friend of mine, she practices in uh, a particular area of white collar defense, right? So defense
mhm,
associated with securities violations. She spent 10 years at the Securities Exchange Commission and she prosecuted some fascinating cases. And she knows, like, when you have to be 100% right, you're going to call her. You're not
mhm.
necessarily going to call, your lower tier. So
Right.
there will be a call to distinguish. But, you know, I also heard a great theory, which I can go into, that you might need to preserve those. So let me know if I should elaborate there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please do.
Yeah. So I teach an AI class, an AI for lawyers class on Maven.
Mhm,
Been incredibly fun. Taught hundreds of lawyers, lots of general counsels, and seeing how lawyers interact with AI, which is kind of in an interesting way, which we can get into. But one of the people in my class last week mentioned, I said, AI is going to raise the bar for everybody. It's going to be like basketball, where as soon as people started lifting weights, the whole, all of basketball got more aggressive. And teams today would beat teams, even iconic teams of the 80s and 90s. In law, I said, okay, if your adversary has AI and can be faster, can research more, can pursue more theories of a case, then, as the defendant or as the opponent, the adversary, you're going to want to do the same thing. So it'll just increase the level of the game. And that's how the United States legal system is set up.
mhm,
And I was making this point, and she said, actually, I think the same is true for compliance. If the Securities and Exchange Commission, if AI would make your compliance filings perfect, then there will be no excuse to have mistakes, right? Like, there's no reason that you should have numbers that are wrong or statements that are incorrect. And so the bar is going to go up. So then you end up needing people to triple check, or the AI has to keep getting better and better because the level of things that are sanctionable or that are non compliant will also go up. So, really, I can see a world where basically, because of AI, just the requirements on everyone are higher across every spectrum in the law.
That's interesting. Let's let's talk a little bit about this idea that you have deployment now of these AI systems. You ChatGPT. One of the things that happened with doctors in the last like 10 years is doctors started complaining about Dr. Google. So they'd get a patient coming in, and the
Mhm.
patient would have their own theories of
Yep.
infection, et cetera, et cetera, and they would come and self-diagnose, and they'd be like, Google said this, and doctors would get really really annoyed, like, oh, you think what, Dr. Google, huh? So in that vein, do you see this kind of like people trying to pursue kind of like ChatGPT style, like, oh, I'm going to go this far, I'm going to try to do pro se and et cetera, and then getting kind of like, do you see judges getting annoyed? Do you see pushback from the legal profession? Do you see some of those things happening?
Yeah, yeah. So fascinating. A friend is a doctor, and we were chatting about this, and he says they call it incidentaloma too, or it's like where you get this idea and then suddenly have it, and there's like interesting issues of like placebo effect and then like reverse placebo effect. Anyway, fascinating. Yeah. So how will this play out for law? So I think there's kind of three scenarios. So there's people who are unlawyered now who will get lawyered, right? So fascinating research out of Stanford that basically showed if you give chat GPT to people who are not lawyers and ask them to review a residential lease, which is pretty common, right? Landlord tenant law is a big area of law. They will essentially find a threshold level of legal issues that is comparable to a lawyer. So this is literally something where people previously didn't get a lawyer and now they do, right?
Mm,
So, the ability to book a private car that Uber gave the whole world,
mm,
this is like a market that didn't exist and it will exist. So that's kind of like very similar to Google with like threshold level of medical research that Google now allows is has expanded that tremendously. So that's the kind of unlawyered become lawyered. So then it's like the people who are lawyered, they get a higher level of lawyering, right? So maybe I DIY already. A lot of entrepreneurs, especially now that I'm a founder, you know, the law, we have this uh, gating mechanism, right? You could even say gatekeepers, which is law school and the bar exam. But I've worked for non lawyers who were better at legal things than lawyers I've worked with, right? Like if you've done enough VC deals or you've done a certain kind of strategic IP transaction, you're pretty savvy in those areas. And so I think AI will help those people across a wider spectrum and get more of that strategy, really make everybody in a position to be the client. So that's kind of that level. And then there's the sort of people like my friend who does the SEC practice, or like a lot of our users at GCAI, they're already really good lawyers and they're just going to be able to deliver more value and do more things, approve more projects, do more initiatives. Like one insight that I saw recently was that I can't remember if it was McKinsey or it was one of these, but said something to the effect of people assume the amount of work is finite, and so therefore AI will take jobs. But that's just not the case. Like there is literally an infinite amount of productivity you could have in any one company, and we could just see this like great industrial revolution style thing, which I think is a pretty leading theory. So I would say I generally agree with that. In terms of the profession getting annoyed, like, yeah, of course we're gonna get annoyed. Like it's just change and it's something different. And I do see that fear, and people are never gonna use the word fear. Like they're not gonna use the word scared, but certainly like apprehension and caution and, is this gonna take my job? But where I've seen the success case of that is lawyers that are like, how do you embrace this and become that super lawyer, that elite class that I mentioned?
indeed. So one of the things that happens is, let's say you have the SEC, for example, and they deploy a lot of this stuff for compliance checking, right? And then the requirements, as you say, will be more compliance is required, right? But perhaps some of the existing rules have an assumed level of non-compliance, right? Like if you they and that's kind of necessary in any Warren Buffett calls it the bezel, right? In any economy there's an amount of bezel in the economy, and it's part and parcel of every company. It can be stuff like people not reporting their whatever they're claiming, or whatever it is, right? There's an assumed amount of bezel, and if you actually clamp down on all bezel at once, like fully, then you also squeeze out like legitimate transactions which were not properly reported, right? And so people are like, oh, you know what, I'm not going to spend on any dinner any business dinner because I sometimes forget a single receipt, and that gets me into trouble. So I'm just not going to spend on any business dinners at all, right? Because I don't want to go through the hassle of ever being non-compliant, right? So how does that work? Like, do you see kind of like, then therefore not all rules can be 100% enforced when you have the power to enforce 100%, but before you were assuming let's say 30% on compliance,
Yeah,
but now
yeah.
you have the power to enforce a full 100%. Does that mean that you have to change kind of like some of those rules?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating economic question. Like, so I majored in economics and thought a lot about this. And, one of the things to your point of like, when can you have a zero fault tolerance? So Michelle Obama in her biography, fascinating biography, but among that, the things that she says is that when she and Barack Obama went to the White House, one of the things that you get as president is effectively a budget to decorate the White House. Like you can buy your own couches, etc. And the Obamas refused the budget because she said, look, any potential appearance of impropriety, because of, potentially their race or how he took office or he was younger, et cetera, et cetera. She's like, we could not have any scrutiny. Like we knew, like, we needed to be perfect. And the way to be perfect was just as you said, was to expense nothing. And so unlike any other predecessor administration, they didn't use any budget for decorating the White House. So then you query whether is 100% compliance actually the goal, right? So Warren Buffett, of course, in his typical brilliance, would say no. And first year torts, literally one of my most memorable law school professors, essentially said that the optimal amount of risk is not zero, right? If you're transporting the example that I used, which is so vivid, I remember it 20 years later, was if you are transporting ceramic plates across the ocean, right? Freight. If you wanted to have it be so no one plate was broken, it would be prohibitively expensive, right? You would like wrap each individual one. You would like, make sure the boat went at certain times. It would basically make no sense to where if your goal was actually making money selling plates, like that's not the optimal low risk. Similarly in software, right? The most secure software does nothing. The most private software also does nothing. So there's absolutely this like, I guess I don't know if I would call it race to the bottom, but race to 100% compliance, which is terrible. And like there would be people that would say, like the EU with regulating AI before they even develop it, are like shooting for that, right? But your question about it at a kind of like legal level, I mean, I think there will be an adjustment. And you mentioned the SEC. So the SEC just came out with a case in April where they prosecuted somebody for insider trading, but of another company's stock. So
Yep.
the guy found out that his company was getting an acquisition offer, and he figured another similarly situated company would see a stock bump. So 7 minutes after he gets the phone call, he trades in that. And previously, it was a question whether trading of other stocks could be considered insider trading. And the SEC prosecuted the case and won. And that's another one where if you have something like a Microsoft recall technology or some ability to see people's entire spectrum, you're already seeing banks look at this with fraud, right? So Chase, I think, has talked very publicly about how they do this, that they can see you get those phone calls when you're traveling or, did you make this charge, et cetera. So I think that will happen. I don't think it will be a race to the bottom, though, because Bezel will find a way. Like I actually think to that point,
Bezel,
like the
Bezel
human,
will find a way.
exactly,
Like
exactly,
life finds a way.
exactly, like the human ingenuity, like I is
Oh my
amazing.
god.
I think it will find a way. Yeah,
Bezel will find a way. Uh, yeah. So it's interesting to watch because the SEC has a bunch of theories on misappropriation of information,
yeah,
which leads into insider trading, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also sophisticated financial players will do as you said, like or you can do stuff like you can buy the entire basket and only short one of the stocks, and you can do a bunch of things which are where you will, if the SEC were to come out and tell you like, hey, just don't trade your own stock, and then people would find like other ways to to profit from that. Credit
Yeah.
default swaps were one of them for some period of time, and then they moved on. Like once the SEC got onto that, they moved on to other things, and so it's
I
in
mean,
this
United
range.
Points, right? Literally, there's an
Yeah,
incredible business. The points guy is like an incredible business. And it's like, because United miles are sort of a currency, right? And so,
yeah,
like, you think about anything that you can apply smarts to. Like, I have a friend who he was early at Uber, and the stories of how people made fraud on Uber are just fascinating, right? Like, so people
yeah,
in would buy, Uber was using the accelerometer on the phone to tell if the phone was moving in order
yeah,
to say, okay, are they spoofing the GPS? And so people would buy like a device to shake the phone in order to basically show that they were drivers. So it's like,
yeah.
it's a fascinating, like, and the financial markets, this is new. I feel pretty strongly around, the financial stuff, that it's kind of old games, new tech is kind of how
Yeah.
I've seen it.
Segue into, okay, so we have a lot of this new technology, AI technology coming out. A lot of it is being used for first drafts, right? Like first drafts of documents. That's where first drafts of documents, initial kind of queries. That's where things are right now. How does that affect young lawyers entering the profession?
Yeah, so I'm bullish on that. I think everybody gets to that higher level by having the first draft done. That
Yeah,
being said, I do tell, so somebody asked me the other day, like, oh, did you, in law school, did you work with study groups? And, maybe I'm an a hole, but I generally didn't, because I really wanted to do the distillation myself, right?
hmm,
So
hmm,
having an outline, you can get an outline from an outline bank, but reading all the cases and sort of like really being your own LLM, reading them all, distilling them, remembering the key points. To me, that I ended up doing quite well in law school because I did that exercise. So I would encourage them, and in law schools, it's a big thing. Like, how is the profession going to adjust? I would encourage them to know how to use the LLMs and get the first drafts, but still be able to do it yourself. Like, it's kind of like, it's very similar to programming, where you're really experienced programmers, sort of like Amjad Masad, CEO of Replit, who had a huge influence on me because I worked for him, basically talks about the 10x engineer becomes a 100x engineer. I think it's going to be same for lawyers. But in terms of what advice I'd give to a first year, like, you have to have that precision and the clarity of ideas. Like, it's funny, I'm hiring for a chief of staff, and we've been very lucky, had 1,200 applicants.
wow,
And,
oh my gosh,
it's amazing. Like, I
yeah,
wrote a good JD, but it's just like people are really inspired by legal AI, and it's just been
hmm,
amazing. But I can
hmm,
tell who straight used the GPT for the response and who put
hmm,
some thought into it. And so then it's like, okay, what is the thought that you're putting in? What is your value add? And so
hmm,
if you start at a certain level of value, which is the first draft, the question is not what value can you create initially, it's what value can you add on top of that.
hmm. Um, so what is that value that you think the human layer adds on top of the AI? What is that? Is it like a certain, like, connection to the final end product or the final user? Like what is that you think that the human layer adds?
Yeah. So in law specifically, I think a lot of it is what is embodied in in-house lawyers. So you're closer to the business, you know the
Hmm,
history, you know the relationships and the risk tolerance, and you have a sense of where the company and the industry and the customer and so on are going. Now, AI can get some of that, but for example, let me give you a good example. So I spoke at the American Association of Marriage Lawyers conference. So kind of
hmm,
random, but they're interested in AI like everybody else. So I gave a talk
hmm,
on that. And I was talking to somebody, and this happened to be in California. And so there were a bunch of lawyers from Northern California and a bunch of lawyers from Southern California. And I asked, I said, oh, okay, what are the differences? And this is all California state law, right? On doctrine, there should be no difference between a marriage lawyer in San Francisco and a marriage lawyer in Southern California. But what they explained to me was like, no, actually, like in Southern California, you litigate first and you ask questions later. They go straight to court. And I'm like, really, why is that? It's like, well, a little bit of it is like the PR angle and the aggressive, et cetera. In Northern California, we're much more like tech companies. Let's work out a deal. Let's mediate, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera. So that
Mm-hmm.
is something that if you didn't practice marriage law, you probably wouldn't necessarily know. And would an AI be able to triangulate location?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but not unless somebody told it to do that. Like the AI would give you the answer of like in, Kramer versus Johnson, XYZ was the
Mm-hmm.
holding, or would give
Mm-hmm.
you that. But these like advocacy piece of like, how does this actually work and how does this play out? And then marriage law is similarly a great example because a lot of it is psychology, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things is like apparently, and I didn't know this, but apparently when you're looking for a divorce lawyer, one of the top questions is, have you ever dealt with a narcissist? To the point where having an FAQ, literally one of the marriage attorneys I talked with was like, I have a very good answer to that because it's the first question everybody asks.
My
So like that's a
gosh.
fascinating question, right? And so like that's nothing to do with the law, right? It's really entirely dynamics.
My gosh. So that's the thing, right? Like how much of it is tacit knowledge that is kind of picked up in practice, and how much of it is case law and legal rules and
Yes.
etc. Like,
Yes.
is there a moment you think that you can see AI start to absorb some of that tacit knowledge? Is it kind of like if you were to use an AI which had kind of a little memory and you use it day to day, would it kind of pick up on like this is what we do? Is that the direction things go?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I talk about GCAI is as a really smart intern that you can train, right?
Hmm.
So if you tell the intern, like, hey, you're not a marketer, you're not a puppy dog, even just in the system level prompts, we've worked really hard to have a system level prompt of like, here's how in-house lawyers speak and act, and here are their goals. And
Hmm.
then the next level of that is like, okay, in this legal department, we're super formal. In this one, we're not. Like, and so being able to express yourself to an AI and
Hmm.
express that tacit knowledge, when people take prompt engineering classes or like get really excited about that, that's what that's what they're thinking about, right? So I definitely see it going that way. That being said, I heard, Jan LeCun on Lex Friedman was a fascinating, 2 hours. I think I was running and I like stopped running to listen to it. But he basically explains, and I have a 4-year-old and I can corroborate this, that the amount of knowledge that LLMs have today, it's all this non-tacit knowledge, right? It's all literally book smarts
Yep.
versus a 4-year-old has had, exponentially more data fed from the literal real world, right? Like, it knows, my 4-year-old knows basic physics. It knows how to climb a ladder. It knows how to do all these, she knows how to do all these things that an LLM just can't. I mean, the area we see this most is the physical world, right? Robotics. But I think you're absolutely right that this like, what do you know from being a human is like
Yeah.
that's where AI is gonna have to go, and it's definitely not there yet.
Let's as we move forward and we see AI acquire more expertise, right? Do you see kind of like the one thing that we are never going to allow an AI to have is the ability to absorb liability, right? So liability is going to rest with either a human being or with an entity, with a corporate entity of some kind, right? So do you see that as like the final point that you need a license as a lawyer in order to absorb that liability that you are that the responsibility that you are providing that service, even if you have LLMs running under you for expertise? Is that something that you could see?
Yeah, I mean, so far we definitely haven't granted AI personhood. But of
Right.
course, there's the like corporations are people too, right? This is the whole there's a line of Supreme Court cases around that. So could we get there? I don't think so. I think you're right that, piercing the corporate veil and these sort of like canons of the law around individual and corporate liability are pretty set. That said, somebody might have said that about Roe v. Wade, right? 50 years of settled precedent. So I'm not completely uh,
or
putting
or
aside
or
that
do you see
possibility.
Or
But
do you see the liability handoff to the manufacturer of the AI, right? Like
yeah,
as like you would a car. So the lawyer could say like, well, I perform my duty, but I was using this tool, and this tool is at fault, right? Like, can do you see that
yeah,
happening?
I do. Yeah. So I spent a year at Cruise with GM, and GM is literally like, this type of liability, and is something that I actually think that autonomous vehicles will there's a huge role for the auto manufacturers to play, in part for this reason that in the internet we've grown up, and all the case law is very clear that it's what you said, that it's like there's section 230, there's writing of terms of use, where it's like, okay, you are responsible for the bad things that happen on our platform. That being said, there is a deep body of case law around encouragement, right? So, the deep fakes issue, or, New York Times has done some fascinating reporting, and really upsetting reporting, essentially on when younger girls in particular post on Instagram, you get creepy people wanting to have sex with them. It can be like, literally, there was like a leotard manufacturer for little girls that, like, saw its Instagram go crazy, and it was all creeps. And you think, like, okay, if the algorithm is serving that up to other people, does Facebook have a role to play? And, I thought Frances Hagen, she was the whistleblower to Congress. I thought her methods were not great, but the underlying point that if your algorithm prioritizes different things that cause harm, like, do you have an obligation to fix that? Now, I do think that this is an area where Google, on balance, has done pretty well compared to some of its tech peers. But that takes time to develop, time and teams, and all these things. And, I don't necessarily know. Like, I made a case, I wrote my law school note back in, 08, or long ago, um, basically saying Section 230 was such a great law and really responsible for the growth of the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still believe that, but I don't believe that the big tech companies now, with whatever 6 of the 10 Fortune 10, you know, they are in a position to solve it, and we should push on them to do that.
What do you mean? Like, how would they solve it, or what is a path forward?
Yeah. So basically, applying the same roadmap and tools to the harm and the downsides of AI as you're applying to the growth. Now, that being said, like, I disagree that it's like, or I agree with Jan LeCun when he's like, these people worrying about AGI, it's like worrying about, you know, jet planes in the time of the Wright brothers. It doesn't make sense. But what does it look like? I think it looks like, it could look like law, where it's like, okay, you have to do XYZ things in developing AI. And certainly the EU feels that way. It could look like just actual liability, right? Like, you have, in the case of Instagram, you have these children who have been victims of something. They should be able to make a claim. Maybe it looks like a fund, right? GM pays and is subject to lots and lots of lawsuits around car issues and car liability issues. Could you have a similar thing where, the big, huge AI makers basically have a defense fund? Maybe it looks like insurance. Maybe it looks like, cell phones, when you pay like 19 fees, maybe there's a like safe usage fee, and the safe usage fee, you can make a claim on it. Like, how this actually turns out, I don't know the how, but the where we're going, of like, ultimately liability in society has to shift somewhere. And if you get these huge amounts of money from being the core AI developer, then, you could certainly make a great case that you should be the party, or part of the party, that pays it. Could look public, it could look like tax. I don't know. This is one of the most fascinating areas. I'd be curious what you think, actually, since you have some experience in this area too.
So I think um, I have a few things that I think. Number one, we can do what we want. It's like if you want to ban it, you can ban it. If you want to put rules in place, you can put rules. Everything is possible. Like, we as a society can make decisions.
Yep.
The main problem I think Congress faces is that there are actually opposing viewpoints. And sometimes only the viewpoints which are very loud are heard publicly. But in private, people use lobbyists to make their other viewpoints heard. And a lot of people actually, even the scientists don't actually agree with a lot of these things. But it's not something that they're willing to publicly say. But
Yeah.
people use their lobbyists to be heard in private conversation. So the fact of the matter is, I think what is actually happening is that the companies are doing a really, really good job of filtering out what they can. But they have like a 99.9% hit rate. I think what no one understands is the scale of what things are
Yeah.
of what is happening. Like no one understands that Facebook is facing something like 10 billion posts a day, right? And so you have, like, let's say 200,000 posts that escape every day, and that hits the press, and it's like, oh, it's a big deal. But then their filtering is already 99.99% good. And so there is a misperception of how good the companies are doing because people don't understand actually the scale of the companies.
Yeah.
And that I think is tough. That I think is a very tough problem, because you could say, for example, hey, and the companies are willing. You can go in and you can check the algos, and they will show you that they're 99.99% good. You can say, like, okay, and Congress can't. Most people can't even think beyond 99%. They're like, oh, if it's 99% filtered, that's pretty good,
That's
right?
good. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but 99% filtered would be like 100 million bad posts, a day on a Facebook scale.
Yeah.
And so people don't really have an understanding of scale. And so I think that feeds into this perception that the companies aren't doing much or aren't doing well, when actually the companies are doing extraordinarily well. They're at like 99.999% like effectiveness at some points. And you have the countervailing thing where you have the negative. You have posts which should have been posted allowed. The canonical case being the Vietnam War photograph of the young girl,
Oh, yeah.
9-year-old.
Yeah.
She's running out, and she's being, she was napalmed, and she's running away from a napalm bombing, which is a historic. It's a historic thing,
Yes.
which is, but it's also falls under the category of child sexual abuse materials. Yes,
Yeah.
CSAM. So
Yeah.
and this is a problem, because then you end up in this, like, okay, I'm going to need a human intervention on this one and this one alone. What about remixes of that? What about if you do a collage of that with something else? What happens then, right? So I think these things are fairly complex, and Congress is not willing to make new law, precisely because they're going to end up with their foot stuck somewhere. This is also why Zuck has been very open to new lawmaking. Zuck has asked multiple times,
Yeah.
please make new laws. Because as soon as you make the laws, I only have to follow them.
Exactly.
Congress prefers that the companies kind of like do what, be bullied in the back end, lobby and spend money on the party infrastructure for lobbying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's good for everyone, right? And you
It
create
is fascinating.
issues.
Yeah,
And
that's
you create an
fascinating.
issue.
I mean,
Yeah.
you said so many amazing threads to pull there, right? So the whole, like, okay, the scale issue, of course, is real, right? So the head of trust and safety, I think for Twitter, that ended up leaving with the Musk thing. It's like, okay, 1 in a million on Twitter is like every 6 minutes. So if you
Yeah.
think about like 1 in a million things that could happen, so that's real. But I could also say, though, right? So if you're saying it's 99.97, we've got Patrick Collison out there saying that Stripe is at 19.9s or something, 9.99 and whatever. So it is possible to innovate. It is possible to have more of these cases. Or flip side, maybe you get back to what I said, which is like, okay, if it's 99.97, it's 0.03% of the time, give everybody a 0.03% tax. And Facebook pays 0.03% of whatever it is into some fund, some victims fund or something. And then you set that up. But yeah, it's definitely like,
But Congress has to make law,
decisions.
though.
Yeah, no, they do. And strategic lawmaking, fascinating.
And whatever law Congress makes has to be equally applicable to Fox News.
Yeah.
And this is where you start getting this. Okay, let's do misinformation, for example, right? Let's do misinformation, or let's like. So I don't think actually Congress will ever make law, because law which is equally applicable to the New York
Impossible.
Times and
Yeah.
Fox News will be extremely damaging to existing news channels if they have to follow the same rules. If you're going to do like one in a thousand or 1 in 100,000, like those channels are basically less able to, right? So I think the thing is, like, we Congress prefers to kind of bully in the back end, and Stripe is a great example, because Stripe has offloaded a lot of sex workers, right? Stripe goes out and they do that. OnlyFans was almost offloaded, from the
Hmm.
financial system,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
OnlyFans was almost offloaded. And as OnlyFans was saying, like, look, we're going to shut down all these accounts, then there was a pushback, like, hey, a lot of these are like single mothers, and this is their only source of income,
yeah. Yeah.
and you're shutting it down, like, they're safe, and if you do this, then they're going to be out in the streets, which is less safe. There's all of this stuff going on there. So the financial system has devolved into this kind of like, oh, if you don't, like, we're going to give you this soft rules, and those soft rules start to intercede into gun shops. And at that point, the Republicans are like, all right, look, no, you can't do that, right? You can't have like JP Morgan say like,
Yeah.
oh, you know what, you're a gun shop, so we're not going to bank you. And there's only four banks, so I think it's Congress has gotten away with a bunch of things around like soft rules. And I think Elon's pushback was the beginning of the pushback. It's going to be interesting to see, because Elon's also getting payment licenses, and he's gonna then you're gonna have this
Yeah.
tying of speech to funding, etc. And so I think there's still a bit more to play out there. I think Elon's willing to go to bat for that. I think Zuck was like, you know what, I don't need to get involved with this. So Zuck was like, please put together a law, and I will follow. That they were not willing to. And he's like, all right, I'm going to set up a council, and so I don't have the decision making power. I'm going to have the council make the decisions. I'm going to put like Republicans and Democrats on the council, and they can make the decision together. It's not because he's like running a utility service. He's running
Yeah.
the pipes in between.
Yeah.
He does not he wants to prevent like bad stuff from going on. He wants people to like use it in a positive manner. But where there is conflict, like, and he's not able to figure out how to intercede, he wants clear instructions from Congress or from someone else, and he's not getting it, and he will never get it. I don't think Congress is able to figure out what speech is going to work for them and what's not. And I think they're aware of that. It's like it's a nice little, like, punching bag to punch around. It's great for donations. It's great for lobbying. It allows everyone to blame someone else without actually taking responsibility for their own side, right? So I'm very like it, like, none of this stuff will ever get resolved, because what we're actually trying to resolve is not the utility services. We're actually trying to resolve the differences between different parts of the public, and those are really hard to resolve, because that's what the political system kind of finds in order to get people to vote. Like, the political system keeps identifying places where people don't agree, and then keeps separating people based on that, in order that you can have a competitive electoral cycle. So I don't think it works. But it's interesting. It's interesting to watch, and this is as an external observer, who it's fascinating. So
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think like these are the issues of our day, right? And I mean, you can see that every tech shift has them, and this is another one. And I definitely, you know, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how, what North Star does the company have then too. I was reading, for example, that since Bezos stepped down, Alexa was a pet project of Bezos. And it turns out that Andy Jassy is like, no, you got to show the bottom line, you got to show profitability, you got to show et cetera. And so innovation in Alexa quite paused since I left and since Bezos left. And so now they're seeing AI and other companies working on it. It's like, okay, how do we fuel that? In the case of Zuck, I mean, the example that you gave of like Zuck just wants to be the pipes. So I somewhat agree with you that he doesn't really want to be in the business of regulation. But I also think that one fascinating thing where this sort of world of startups and world of AI regulation come together, and now that I'm a founder, I've realized is that companies really are. in the image of their founder. Like it's
Yeah.
literally, we used to say at Amazon that Amazon was like a scaffolding built around Jeff's brain. And I certainly saw that. And I've worked for some amazing founders, Amjad and Austin Allred, and like just seeing how the company does that. So then it's like, okay, what is Zuck's worldview now? And if the North Star is connect more people, make more money, 2 out of 3 people on earth literally use the meta apps every day, then it's like, okay, like there probably should be some regulation and probably having that be, like one of the North Stars should be the societal good, right? So how do you institutionalize that? Like this is very difficult. And I don't know that, you know, that it could have gone many ways, right? Like it could, GDPR has had a certain effect. Like the effects of GDPR have been shown to basically slow innovation in Europe. It's like I don't think they necessarily wanted to show that. So yeah, I'm just like you. I'm fascinated to see this sometimes from the inside, sometimes from the outside.
Yeah, I think so. The big thing that I think right now is happening is, and we can naturally flow into this, is training data, right? So the big question is for all these firms is a lot of data on the web has been scraped, and including, like, let's say YouTube. YouTube was scraped, looks like,
Yeah,
and against the terms of service. YouTube was scraped. A lot of data was scraped, and it was fed into these models, and these models then, created. You have these AIs being created out of them.
yeah.
And so one of the big questions is there liability there for the training data? I mean, should they have paid for the training data? And are they, they're all getting sued right now, or what is going to happen there? What do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a fascinating question. So the training data issue, there's the like, should you pay for good content? And that's like, I think this is a Napster moment where there will be a commercial solution. You're seeing there was the OpenAI paid News Corp this week. The holding company, the I forget the name of it, but the publishers of Better Homes and Gardens and other magazines, is getting paid by OpenAI. And New York Times came out this week and said, look, the fact that you're doing all these deals makes very clear that this is information that you should pay for. So there's sort of like the copyright, the creative expression value. That's kind of one issue. And then there's these bias issues around the internet is very Western still and kind of male. Like there is still data, for example, that Wikipedia entries are 87% written by men, something like that. I need to check the stat, but in any case, quite high. To where for me,
Probably follows the incidence of autism.
yeah, well, like there was the guy, there's the literally the number one editor on Wikipedia. He
Yeah,
works for, I think he works for Customs and Border Patrol, or he's a
yeah,
government worker
yeah,
during the day. And during the evening, he spends 5-6 hours a day,
yeah,
every day editing Wikipedia, which is great. And it's incredible public service, but there's no question that it's reflecting his point of view, right?
yeah,
So you can look for some really obscure, nerdy stuff on Wikipedia and get
yeah,
answers.
yeah,
And yet the article about, for a while I think there was not a good article about ovulation, which is like a basic process, right? So like things like that, and that has been fixed. That was, I think, 10 years ago came out that was the case. But the way you see that show up, in the image context, it's probably the most stark. So there was a really cool, I'll show you this picture. I don't know if I have the ability to share screen, but anyways, there's the here, let me see if I can do that.
you can
Yeah,
try.
so here we go. AI and the American smile. So essentially,
Ah,
because all of our data,
mm-hmm,
the training data on Facebook and other places,
mm-hmm,
is the big toothy grins.
mm-hmm.
Culturally, a big toothy grin is not a thing among samurai soldiers. It's not a
Right,
thing among Native Americans, right?
right, right,
So you
right.
see these like, World War II soldiers with this like big modern toothy selfie.
Yeah,
That's just not a thing. And so you imagine if we get more training data that's more reflective of other things. But this particular author makes a really good case about that. And it's like, that's a very visual example, but similarly across the spectrum, right? Like Satya Nadella in Hit Refresh, at the beginning of Hit Refresh, he does
yeah,
a whole exposition of a game of cricket. And he uses all the cricket terminology. And like, I will admit that, like, probably most readers of his book, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he makes that point at the end of the chapter. He's like, look, I have this different point of view. And, the various different cricket terminology, he explains it. And he's like, this is how it is to be CEO of a very global company, where it's like people don't even realize they have biases or they have a worldview they don't even know they have. And so I think AI is going to, and particularly training data, is going to bring that more to the fore. And you and I, we're lucky, right? Like we're in this Silicon Valley culture. I've been a daily user of the internet for 20 plus years. Like, and as the rest of the world comes onto this, they will be, I guess, more digital immigrants used to be the term, right? Digital natives, digital immigrants. I think we're going to have AI natives and AI immigrants.
So one of the funny things is I travel quite extensively, and I have noticed Netflix English everywhere now.
Netflix
So
English. Say more about
Netflix and
that. Yeah, yeah.
Netflix and YouTube English. So and I sometimes you speak to a Scandinavian or whatever, and they have like good English,
Yeah, yeah,
but there are Scandinavians who have good English that they learned in school, and there's Scandinavians who have good English that they picked up on YouTube,
yeah. Yes.
Netflix, and they make fun of each other. But everyone's like, oh, she talks like YouTube, she talks like Netflix.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
You can go to Paris now, and waiters in Paris like 10, 15 years ago, if you can't speak French, they would be very rude to you. And now they're like, dude, come on, like we could just speak in English here, like it's okay,
Exactly. Oh,
right?
totally. I noticed the same thing in Vietnam last year. I had a wonderful trip. There's now a direct flight from SFO to Ho Chi Minh City, which is amazing. So I had a really fun time there, and noticed the English was weirdly good in some places. But it
Yeah.
was also, just like you said, like Netflix English is a perfect. So congrats on coining that term, but it was a perfect encapsulation because people who, and they're like, oh yeah, I just watch videos, and it was like
Yeah.
it was amazing. Yeah.
So, in terms of training data, I think there's a fair use argument that people have put forward. Like number one is fair use. That's one. One of the complications, I think, is open source, because open source, is clearly nonprofit. They release the models, and you can do whatever you want with them. So clearly, there's a fair use argument there that you can take, training data, you can scrape off the web, you can train a open source model, and you can release it, and you're not making any money off it, etc. There's a little bit of like artifice there, because there's what Stability AI did in Europe was they funded Lion, and Lion had the 5 billion image data set. So Stability, I mean, they partially funded, so they gave them a little bit of a grant. So Lion was based in Germany. Some of the German researchers set that up, and then they scraped the web for all these images, and then they provided that data set. That data set was then used to train Stability's own models. So the question becomes like, okay, the scraping was done by a nonprofit. The nonprofit was funded by a grant. The grant was granted by the for-profit. The for-profit then used the data out of the nonprofit to train its models. It then released that model open source, but then it also serves that model on a for-profit basis using its own APIs, and it does consulting for clients based on that, right? So there's this huge web of complex things that are going on, and then there's the next versions of the model. The next version of the model is often trained on the last model's outputs. So then you're not even training on the original data set, you're training on a product of an open source model, which is what is happening now with some of this. So, and then it becomes even more tenuous, right? You're not even training on the original data set anymore. You're training on the output of the model from the prior one. What Midjourney is doing, for example, right now, the RLHF, they produce, when you go into Midjourney and you ask for an image, it produces 4 images for you. Then you decide which one to upscale. That point of like you selecting the upscale, that's how they train the next version, because now they know which images are preferred by the user, and so that's their reinforcement learning human feedback. They're blending in that user's preference with the existing like large base of models in order to figure out how to produce a better image. So there's all of these things going on, and I think it's very hard to disentangle at the end of the day. It looks to me like a fairly straightforward kind of fair use at the beginning, but there's these complexities around like, okay, the terms of service, did they break the terms of service when they're doing it, and how far does this poisoned apple go, right? The fruit of the poison tree how far can you actually trace it down and say, before you say like, look, we can't do anything about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, so many threads to pull there. The legal doctrine one, fruit of the poisonous tree, just because I'll be the token lawyer on the pod. But basically, for it's a legal concept where in a criminal case, if evidence was illegally obtained, then it cannot be used in the prosecution of a defendant. And fruit of the poisonous tree is like anything downstream from that. So if evidence was illegally obtained, they get a particular source that they shouldn't have gotten. What that source says cannot be used. So similarly here, it's a great analogy because I think there is this inextricable chain, and it almost reminds me back to the earlier in the pod, right, where it's like Bezel finds a way, like commerce and sort of like the ability to make money finds a way, right? And so you could say, like, Zuck, we were talking a lot about Zuck, like having an open source strategy where what is valuable is not the AI generation, but is the connection to humans, which again, he's got 2 out of 3 people in the world using it. Like there's an economic driver of that too, right? And so like it really is like getting down to the heart of it is like the complexity is incredible. That being said, on fair use in particular, that is a system that has, really stood the test of time, right? It's been around since the 1800s. And it's like literally the original case was something that had to do with George Washington's biography being reused. So I think fair use and copyright can figure out a way. But there is a wider question to your point of like, is it the right framework? Like, right? So people have made the case, like Justice Ginsburg, who is one of my favorites. Essentially, people have said she never met a copyright she didn't like. She would protect copyright at all expenses. And like, is that the right thing to prioritize? Maybe. But what about, the output, and what about the good? What about if we're using AI for doctors? Like, should we all be obligated to do that? Or are we going to have a society where, okay, I'm a particular patient, I'm going to pay extra so my stuff doesn't get trained on, and then all everybody else is going to be training data for me? Like, is that right? It really does it all come down to money? Like, the number of philosophical and societal threads you can pull is basically infinite. So yeah, how do we deal with training data? I do think though there could be an economic solution. There are folks that talk about essentially microtransactions as the way to do it. We have the technology, right? We talked about Stripe at like 17 nines of reliability. When I used to work at Yahoo, even back in the 2000s, we used to say that if you consider every click a transaction, then Yahoo had more transactions than Visa. And certainly the case now for Google, right, or Facebook, they're tracking every click. So they certainly have a way. If you're tracking every click, it's not that hard to then figure out some economic value. When I think about myself, I've been a user of Craigslist since probably 2000, right? And written so much on there, including they used to have text-based forums that have now been replaced by Google group or, Facebook groups or whatever. But I was part of a mom's group when my oldest, who's a teenager, was a baby. And I wrote long posts explaining, breastfeeding or explaining, colic or whatever it was. And so I always wondered to myself, if you ask ChatGPT how to deal with a colicky baby, was it trained on stuff I wrote? Probably.
Exactly, right? Like, so if you've been posting for long enough, your posts become part of the internet, and they
Yep.
get
And then
transmitted.
YouTube and this podcast will get very meta. So you and I are
Exactly.
training future models.
Exactly. I always encourage people to post now, because I'm like, you don't understand how early you are in the life cycle of content creation. One of the things Benedict Evans, former Andreessen Horowitz, he has this great graph of a number of photographs taken. And a number of photographs taken historically is like, daguerreotype, and then 1800s, and then, small. And even into the 1990s, digital cameras is still fairly small. Then 2007 hits and the smartphone hits, and all of a sudden the number of photos just like zooms upwards, right? And now
Yes.
probably like every minute you have more creation of photographs than all of human history before 2007, right? And so I think in the same way, we're in that period where we're seeing AI,
Yes.
content creation now,
Yes.
and we're about to see AI textual content creation, like just zoom upwards, so like AI assisted
Yes.
textual content creation. And so if you create content right now, if you post stuff right now, you have this advantage of being really early in the cycle. And so you have, basically, whatever you say gets expounded on like a millionfold going forward. So that's
Yeah,
one of the advantages.
that's fascinating. I mean, I with Google Photos, it's funny when I was at Yahoo, Flickr, Yahoo acquired Flickr at the time that I was there, and it was like, having the big digital cameras and everything. But like, I've thought about for my kids, my youngest is 4 and my oldest is a teenager, and the youngest has multiple pictures of her every day, right? So when
Yeah,
you think about her being able to create an AI avatar, my youngest has a huge advantage. So yeah,
exactly.
I agree with your advice. And
Yeah,
even,
yeah,
I think Google doesn't actually get enough credit for that, for the photos AI. That's, I would
yeah,
say, I think in one of the prep questions you asked, like, what have been the wow moments with AI? And I've had
yeah.
many, but Google being able to, if you search my Google Photos, of which now I have almost 100,000 photos, for ice cream. You get every instance of ice cream I've ever eaten, and it's just a
Indeed.
fascinating, fascinating application of CV.
So speaking of everyone's data being everywhere, so the Scarlett Johansson thing. So what happened? What happened in the last couple of weeks is OpenAI did this demo, and they have emotive voice. So I've done some work on emotive voice. I interviewed Alan Cohen, who was the founder of Whom. And it took him like 10 years to kind of put together all of the theses and try to get that emotive voice working. And he went and like he did ethnographic studies of people, and they took like 6 million YouTube clips, and they like identified each kind of emotion there, and like they got that. And OpenAI had continued on that, and they had emotive voice working, and the voice that they were using sounded eerily like Scarlett Johansson. The voice has been around in ChatGPT since October 2023. At that time, Reddit people on Reddit had already said like it sounds like Scarlett Johansson. So you already had that, but it was not very well known. I don't think a lot of people are using ChatGPT voice. And so when they did this demo last week, it became huge. And then Scarlett Johansson herself, sent out I guess, a cease and desist of some kind, and they stopped. They said they took it off. It's been taken off the phones, and that's where we are. A few days earlier last week, in France, Romain Houet, who is a product manager at OpenAI, demoed their voice engine, and he basically takes a 15-second sample of himself speaking. He presses record, talks into the mic for about 15 seconds, and about 30 seconds later, he is displaying a Sora video with his voiceover in his voice, in multiple languages, and it's basically just spoofing his voice with a 15-second audio clip. So that's where we are right now, and we're in the zone. And I have put forward this theory that basically voice spoofing, voice cloning used to be this kind of like high art, which required 4090 NVIDIA chip, text to speech models, Python, and you needed like a machine learning engineer to kind of sit there and spend a couple of days like tuning it, and finally you get something, which is what 11 Labs was doing. But now it looks like it's going to be easily available with a 15-second audio clip. Anyone can do it. So where do we go to from here? Who was in the right? Who was in the wrong? What do you think? Where do we go from here?
Yeah. So um, this is one where the law and like what's right don't necessarily match up. But as a legal matter, ScarJo has a case, but I would not say it's a slam dunk. So
Yeah.
the precedent on it is basically California has a law um, around right of publicity. And the law basically talks about misappropriation of likeness. So, California Civil Code 3344, this statute provides that any person who knowingly uses another's name, voice, signature, photograph, or likeness in any manner, or in products, merchandise, or goods, or for purposes of advertising or selling, without such person's consent, shall be liable for damages. Now, did they use her voice? No, they didn't. Like, the facts are actually pretty clear, right? Like, at this point, we have the timeline that they went out and they got a voice actress. And in the case of getting the voice actress, they did not actually uh, tell her that she needed to be like Scarlett Johansson. I think the job ad said something like, modern, fresh female voice, something like that. And so that happened, and that was actually before they reached out to ScarJo. Now, in the whole like companies are in the image of the founder, was Sam Altman inspired by the movie Her? Yes, publicly. He's talked about it for years. And like the idea of AGI and the idea of a sentient companion, like this is something that no doubt inspired him to the point of calling her twice. Right. And so then it's like, all right, if this is what we're going for, then it's like, how do you square the law with that? The case in this area, there was a case, Bette Midler, so famous singer. Ford wanted to do an ad with her. They call her. She says no. They cast an actress to do the thing, and they say they want her to be like Bette Midler. So that case, actually, Bette Midler won, and there was a violation found. So how does that apply here? Tough to say, but I think your point of like now imitating voice is trivial. We're in that very similar tech moment where when photography literally came out, people were like, this is my soul. There's fascinating articles that from the press at the time, that you could do a control F and basically like replace them and have them apply to AI now. So I think society will adjust a little bit. I do think you're going to have, new potential for fraud, just like with any other tech, right? Like spam and, social engineering. It's always social engineering when you get these big, hacker attacks. You can almost always trace them back to some person. And of course, there's the case of the worker, and I think was it in Korea in Korea who wired millions of dollars because there was a deep fake of a CFO of an exec at his company. And so, I think we're going to have to catch up because Bezel finds a way. But I see this as a new way to kind of have that fraud. But legally, I mean, maybe we get to a voice print situation, right? We have official driver's licenses. I just got my passport renewed and it's got all this special ink and all this stuff. So maybe we get to where we have a voice print. I don't know the solution.
Yeah, I think I think OpenAI's problem will be that they will have emails inside the company with like, "Oh, it sounds like Scarlett Johansson," like blah 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 blah, like and Slack messages, of course.
For
So
sure.
yeah,
Well, this is
yeah,
why you need
so
in-house lawyers. So taking it
yeah,
back to
yeah,
my business, to GCAI, like
yeah,
when I
yeah,
was at Amazon, I was there when we did the deals with the voice talent. And
yeah,
I think there's sort of the legal side of like, okay, make sure that your licenses are very clear,
yeah,
all time, any medium, any technology ever invented. So
yeah.
make sure that your IP license is clear. And then there's this sort of like the almost like morality slash deal making point where, for example, Dan Rose, who was the chairman of Cotu, was the head of business development at Facebook for Zuck, incredible deal maker, like widely known as the best deal maker in the Valley, and or I guess America, whatever, pick your metric. But anyways, he says that when he first started doing business development for Kindle, Bezos told him for Amazon Kindle, the ebook reader before it came out, Bezos told him, don't tell the publishers what we're doing. And so he had to try and get IP licenses with publishers without telling them that he was making an e-reader. And he said, as a BD matter, that was actually really difficult. And so a big breakthrough for him came when he basically went to Jeff and convinced Jeff, like, hey, look, I think if we explain that it's an e-reader, we will get better and better deals and more trust. And so he did that. And so similarly here with the voice talent, like, would the right move have been to tell ScarJo, like, hey, we're doing this, like legally we can, do you want to cut? And ScarJo was represented by Brian Lord, the head of CAA, the biggest agency in the world, the most powerful guy in Hollywood. Like they could have gotten a deal done. And so like probably that would have been the right move. But is she like a canary in the coal mine of like this wider issue of like what rights do I have in my voice? Like absolutely. And that's why I think the case has caught so much imagination, and then ScarJo and CAA are obviously masters of PR.
Well, I think I'd push back on a little that she would want to do the deal because I think for any amount of money, I think the fact is that she has a brand and there's a scarcity value. You don't want to be the elevator music
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
it's
next
true.
millennium, right? You don't want
It's
to
true.
be, you don't want people to like, oh, there's the saxophonist who, every time you go into a doctor's office, you hear in the
Yeah.
background. You don't want,
You
you
don't
don't
want to be
want that.
that. No, you
You
don't.
don't want
And
to be
I
that.
mean,
You
even
don't want
the woman
to, right?
who played Alexa, it's like now
Yeah.
people know who she is and so on.
It is
But
the largest drop in the naming. Like Alexa used to be a popular American name,
yeah,
and there's been something like a 70% decline in the number of Alexas because people don't want to name their kids Alexa anymore.
yeah.
Um, so
Well, since I
you
worked there, I got petitioned. Since I worked on Alexa, I was a product counsel for Alexa. I would get contacted on the internet by this group that was like, "We want our name back," So literally, it was exactly that.
and it's funny because now if they decide to shut down Alexa and they move on to the next generation, it's a different name. These people will get their name back. So
Yeah,
after
exactly,
after
exactly.
after like 10 years of ten
Exactly.
years
No,
of
I
having,
know. It's
yeah,
like, is it really back? Yeah, no, it's
yeah.
it's fascinating. I mean, that was one of the things when we had Alexa was like, what do we do as the wake words? And then what voices do people have? And then even honestly with her, I think what's fascinating is like, why do these assistants always have to be female? Right. So like I'll be very clear, like one of my, if I haven't already, like one of my, I'm a feminist, like I'm a woman CEO of an AI company, came up in tech and so on.
Yeah.
And so, like, is it a foregone conclusion, and even when you think about your avatar, right? Like, is it a foregone conclusion that AI needs to be female? Like,
Yep.
no, like, and why? Like, so,
Right.
but then, people talk about on the GPS, like a friend of mine still uses like the car native GPS, and she has this Australian guy's voice, and she's like, when he messes up, I think it's funny. It's like, oh, turn left or whatever, and she just laughs about it. So it's interesting, all these like kind of cultural, social things, how AI pulls them all together.
Indeed. So, Cecilia, what is next for GCAI? Like, what are you guys looking forward to?
Yeah, so we hit 500 users, which 500 lawyers is actually quite a lot, and then basically just growing like crazy. But the thing I'm most proud of is the customer feedback. So all those like jaw-dropping moments, people have been having them, and that's been really our North Star around like, okay, it really does feel like having an AI intern. We had somebody this week who she's a solo GC of a company with, I think, like 8 holding companies. It's a holding company and she's got 8 portfolio companies. So she's like, it's like having, a legal associate for all of my companies. And it's like, it's just been so fun. But what's next? Scaling, hiring. I don't know, depending on timing, might have announcements around that. But in any event, that's basically going to be doing this. I'm convinced that AI and legal are a really good match, and I'm seeing it every day in the usage. And so we're building out. Now it's a chat based modality. We're going to be adding different plugins, looking at agentic things, but really, helping in house lawyers and helping their companies.
Do your users come back to you and sometimes say like, look, this would have taken me an hour, 2 hours, but it was done in like 20 seconds? Do they have that experience
Yeah, every day. Yeah,
every day?
across domains. So kind of a fun one. We had a user who she is general counsel at a company that does a lot of open source, and basically needed to look at the different open source licenses that they had put out packages under. And it's kind of a lawyer task, right? She needed to open up the license files, look at them, write some kind of comparative analysis. She gave our tool, she gave GCAI their top level GitHub and said, make me a chart of the different open source packages that we have used and the license. So uh, is it MIT? Is it BSD? Whatever it is. And a sentence or two on like what, the import and if we should change it, whatever. Says go. And she did that in one shot.
Wow.
So she got 30 packages. It crawled the 30 packages. It pulled out the license files,
Wow.
package name, MIT. And that's, like the beginnings of being agentic, right? Where it's
Right.
like,
Right.
okay,
Right.
I'm asking you to do a legal task and you
Yeah.
go out and do it for me. Now, is it really like a legal analysis? Some of it was literally just going to the web. But that was one that happened, I think, a couple weeks ago. And we're like, oh my gosh, can we use this in our newsletter? Because this is amazing. So, like, that was one. Another one, We had somebody get like an HR complaint and, needed to write a response, uploads the complaint to the tool and gets a response. And he's like, I think I made one sentence edit, but it was exactly what I wanted. So like stuff like that happens every day. The agentic stuff a little bit more. We had another one that we use in the materials where somebody had an issue with one of the properties that their company owned or their company leased and needed to write a letter to the landlord, uploads the lease. And this is the part that was crazy. He's like, write a letter to the landlord about this issue. Our tool pulled out the relevant provision of the lease, quotes it, and has it in the letter. Dear landlord, per Article 8, Section A, your obligation is blah, blah, blah. Fix this immediately. Thank you, GC. And that's would have been a 15-minute task, but it was about 2 minutes, 30 seconds, what have you. So these kind of like exponential differences that I think the papers talk about. I think the big paper in law says something like, it's called Better Call GPT, but it's essentially a play on Better Call Saul. But the paper says, I know, right? I that one made me laugh too. You and I seem to have a similar appreciation for pop culture. But anyways, the paper said 77 times faster at 0.3% of the price in closed tests. And we see that play out. Now, where this gets interesting is like, okay, a closed test, you still have to have a lawyer telling you what to look for, right? And like in this case, she knew she needed to do the open source analysis, and she's a very sophisticated lawyer. And so she was able to take that chart and like explain the implications and do that next logical step. But that's where I see, that's our roadmap basically at GCAI, is like, how do we take that next logical step for people? But yeah, we have, you're reminding me that I should update the quotes on our website. And that's my other, if I were to give your AI founders or AI investors advice, is like the user quotes. And this is my Amazon talking, is like when you actually get user reviews and user quotes, that to me distinguishes the hype companies from the real ones. And so that's been probably the most, I would say that's the single most rewarding thing as a founder is users that come to us with that.
Absolutely. Well, Cecilia, thank you for your time. It was a very enjoyable discussion. And hope to see you soon again.
Yeah, likewise, Abe. This was really fun. I literally I'm looking at the clock and I didn't even realize the time. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Emergent Behavior is a part of the Turpentine Network. For our full newsletter, visit emergentbehavior.co. For more Turpentine podcasts and sponsorship inquiries, visit turpentine.co.